go.
The race row, which has been sizzling under the surface here at SOAS, has once again raised its head. A damning motion calling for the resignation of Jordan Anderson, the SOAS Anti-Racism Officer, has been submitted for this Wednesday's UGM. Charlene Amoko and Simeon Brown are aiming to pass the resolution that, quote, the anti-racist officer be called to resign and re-elections take place. So where did this begin? It was here, on Wednesday the 15th of October, that the president of the SNEWS, Wes Streeting, was taking part in a meeting on free education. Mr. Anderson was sitting in the front row about this area. All of a sudden, follow me, protesters led by SOAS Mature Students Officer Mpegwa Makangata stormed the area here. They chanted, slavery is no joke, Wes Streeting has got to go. And their aim was the resignation of Wes Streeting. They accused him of failing to act against institutional racism within the SNEWS. This led to angry exchanges where Mr. Anderson accuses the protesters of intimidation. Now SNEWS is very happy to be joined by the anti-racist officer, Mr. Jordan Anderson. Mr. Anderson, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, could you tell me from your point of view exactly what happened on the day with the anti-slavery leaflet?
Well, I think the first thing that's important to realize, this was actually the third leaflet I was presented with that day. And I'd read the first two. In fact, I'd passed the first one on to someone else to read. And by the time I'd received this third one, it was half an hour into the occupation of the meeting. And having read it and having had a third interview leaflet forced into my hands once more time, in the end, sitting in the audience quietly, as I was sitting there, I was annoyed enough that I tore what was in my hands. If I'd been holding a pen, I think I would have broken the pen. I was holding that leaflet. So I think in the end, it wasn't so much about the contents of the leaflet as it was about the fact that I was annoyed that the meeting had been occupied for half an hour, and we've effectively been prevented from hearing what the meeting was meant to be about. So I think it's not so much aimed at the leaflet as it was at the way the leaflet was given.
You're saying you're being grossly misrepresented by the protesters?
Yes, I would say that's very fair.
Right, many people have accused you of not taking race issues seriously. For example, if you remember, your initial campaign to become anti-racist officer was to dress as Borat. Now, how can you convince people that you're serious going on those?
Well, I think that firstly, the point of the initial campaign was a satirical one about how easy it is to alienate people from an office if it's done in a really sort of bizarre, extrapolated way. But obviously, when I realized I was the only person who cared enough to put my name forward and run for this office, I realized it's not enough just to run a satirical point. So, as anyone who was at the hustings and anyone who remembers the initial campaign will remember, I then switched my campaign to a serious one with a real message, which we think very much came out, and I think in the end that's why I did win. But in the end, I think the most important thing about addressing racism is that we treat it both seriously and credibly. And what I thought was sort of lacked the most credibility about this protest was the fact that they claimed that the point of it was in order to force a meeting with Wes Streeting to allow them to discuss their concerns. However, the first thing which Wes Streeting said when he got up to talk was that he would be happy to meet with anyone afterwards about any concerns that they had. And I personally was planning to speak to him afterwards about some of these concerns we had expressed at NUS. In the end, it wasn't necessary to occupy the meeting and prevent it from going forwards to get that meeting with Wes. He'd already promised it. So I think the reason this protest was incredible was because all it achieved was disrupting a meeting about free education. So I think that's why it's really important that we treat racism both credibly and seriously.
But is there some truth in the claim, in Mpegwa's claim, that Wes Streeting shouldn't have been invited anyway because of the motion that was passed?
I think that is an issue which, like I say, at the start of the meeting, I started out with possibly some sympathy for. I did wonder why he was there. I think, in the end, I do come down on the side of what the statement Nizam has put out, that in the end, he's not been banned from speaking at the union, so technically, the fact that Wes was there speaking wasn't against the letter of the motion. It may have been against possibly the spirit, but in the end, Wes had been invited before that had been passed, and he did have the right to be there, as he hadn't been banned from speaking, I think is what I would say in the end.
Do you think Wes Streeting should resign for failing to act against institutional racism?
I think the fact is that is what the SOAS UGM motion put forward. That is the view of the entire exec, and that's something we stand behind.
Right. Well, many of your supporters claim that the reason why you're being given a hard time as anti-racist officer is because you're, let's say, not a socialist, you lean towards the right. Do you think there's any credibility in that?
I think there is a perception among and I'd say this only actually applies to certain people. There is this perception that someone, if they're not a socialist, if they're not a member of Respect, in some instances, if they're not actually, Black or an Asian, there is this sort of almost a stereotype that if you do lean this way, that you can't take racism seriously and do that. And I think that's actually a very minority view. I think actually if you look at a lot of people who do support it, they reflect the entire spectrum. And I think that's actually really key to the fact that anti-racism is something which matters to everyone of all persuasions and all spectrums. And that's why I feel I can do this job in the same way as a socialist could, because in the end, we agree on what anti-racism means. And I think that's what's most key to this.
If students vote for this motion and you're forced to resign, will you be running again?
I think, well, firstly, we're going to try and take all steps we can to see that that doesn't happen. We think my having to resign over this would send completely the wrong message about what it means to be in the student union, about what it means to be, have freedom of expression in the union. But in the end, that is something I would strongly consider, once again, possibly just because of I received over 500 votes when we first ran for this, and that'll be more people than will be at the UGM. So we think that's a mandate there. But I think the key issue is the fact that anti-racism really is something that I think needs to be taken seriously, is something that needs to be done about. So in the end, I would strongly consider running again if I think I need to be there to push that through and make sure it is taken seriously and treated credibly.
Jordan Anderson, thank you for talking to SNEWS.
No problem.
This is Alex Donald reporting, SNEWS, SOAS JCR.